Thanks, worship team. And happy Family Day to everyone. Glad to have everybody here with us this morning. Just about 2 minutes before the service started, my daughter Kendra just sort of leaned over and said, "So, Dad, what are you preaching on this morning?" And I said, "Well, we're looking at part 2 of Gideon." So she's like, "So basically, don't be an idiot like Gideon?" And I was like, she's like, "Why don't you just tell the people that and just keep it really, really simple?" I'm like, "So with that in mind, let's just close in prayer." But why don't we work through the text? We'll just see if how accurate Kendra is this morning. Actually, it's kind of funny. Is just part of that. One of the probably the most well-known quotes. It's extremely overused. One that I think I can't help but think that fits well with Gideon. But one of the reasons why quotes often get overused so often is because they obviously must have some sort of kernel of truth behind them. But I'm thinking about the quote made famous by historian and British lord, often known as just Lord Acton, when he said these words: "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And sadly, I think when we look at the second part of the Gideon story, this describes Gideon. Last week we looked at the rise of Gideon. This week we're going to look at the fall of Gideon. Now, as I say that, let me just point a couple things out. From a worldly perspective, really this is not the fall of Gideon. From a position of power, prestige, popularity, politics, all those things, Gideon, he had a meteoric rise. And again, he died extremely wealthy, extremely popular, and again, in a place of extreme privilege. But from a moral level, from a spiritual level, the fall was pretty significant. There's this notion that we often have that we think, if I just had a little bit more money, if I had a little bit more power, if I had a little bit more prestige, popularity, I would use it for good. I would use it to make the world better. We don't think we would fall to the same vices of other people. But sadly, Gideon is one of those reminders that power has the ability to corrupt us. So we're going to look at his life, his second half of his life, and we're looking at the part that you generally, half of his life that you don't usually cover in Sunday school time. We usually get to the first half where he has the verse victory, but we sort of just leave out the second half, the end of his life, and that's what we're going to look at this morning. We're going to pick things up at where we left off last week at Judges chapter 7, verse 15. And this is this series we're doing through the book of Judges. We're calling it Broken Gavels. And it's this amazing story of how these different judges that God raises up to help deliver the Israelites, they're broken in themselves, and yet in God's mercy, he uses these flawed people to bring about peace and sort of restoration back to the land. But before we jump in, let me just do a quick recap of what we covered last week in the Gideon story, and then we'll pick it up again. So the Gideon story actually begins in Judges chapter 6, and it starts with this cycle that is repeated over and over throughout the book of Judges. And we've kind of put it this way with 4 R's, but usually there's this time of peace. We'll call it restoration. Everything seems to be fine, at least on a surface level. And then the Israelites, they begin to rebel. Specifically, they begin to worship these foreign pagan gods of the land, which they've been warned not to. And as a result of their rebellion comes a time of retribution. There comes a time of correction, and usually it works as an outside nation coming in and oppressing them. Again, so that's that retribution. In this particular case, it's the Midianites, and then they've got some other friends that are joining in on the attack on the Israelites. So they take as much as they can, and then they call out for God, and then God raises up a deliverer. Now, there's a slight correct change with Gideon. So initially, they call out for help. God raises up a deliverer, no questions asked, delivers the people. There's a bit of a battle. Israelites win, and everything goes back to normal again. With Gideon, it's slightly different. Before Gideon arrives, God sends an opening act, a prophet, and who rebukes them, who warns them. He says, yes, I have saved you. time and time again, I will save you again. But the reason why you're falling and getting into this trouble and this mess that you're in, it's because of your idolatry. It is because of your sin. It's because you're playing fast and loose with the pagan gods of this land, this ones that I've warned you about. And then all of a sudden we raise up Gideon, but just instead of just here's this guy who comes in and wins this battle, we get a lot of backstory with Gideon. So what are some of the things that we learn about Gideon? The first thing that we learn about Gideon was that he was a fraidy cat. He was a scaredy cat, right? He's hiding in the midst of a wine press because he's afraid of the Midianites. And as you go and before the battle happens, at least 7 times, God has to affirm to Gideon that you are, in fact, my guy. You are the one I'm going to use to help deliver the Israelites. So he needs that. The second thing we learn is that Gideon, as soon as God speaks to him or he meets this angel, he says, it's all God's fault that all this bad stuff is happening. But then we're just told that not only is he blaming God for the problems of the land and for his people, we find out that in his own home has a shrine to Baal and Asherah, right? His home is a place of pagan worship. Kind of important detail. Another thing that we learn out just in this passage is there's this curious play on words with the word hand. And God repeatedly says, I'm going to deliver the Midianites into your hand, right? But he says, it's going to be my hand that saves. And Gideon keeps saying, well, it's going to be my hand that delivers, right? And God says, no. I will be the one who delivers, but it's just going to be to your hand, but it's going to be through my hand, God's power. And one of the reasons we can argue that God chose Gideon as this deliverer, so people would be clear that it was God who's doing the saving and not this clown Gideon. And it's funny, just as where we left off last week, we have Gideon who starts with an army of 32,000 people, whittles it down to 300. God says, I want to make sure it's down to this small level so people will all know that it is by my hand that does the saving. And we're going to pick things up at chapter 7, verse 15. And just as we come in, God gives Midian this last sign. And he says, why don't you go down, take your servant, go down to the Midian camp and just listen for yourself what they're thinking. As he arrives, he hears these 2 Midianite soldiers, and one of them saying, I had this dream last night, and it was a scary dream about a scary loaf of bread that tumbles into the camp and turns everything over. And when Gideon hears this, he says, okay. And then sort of the other soldier says, that's God. That means he's going to turn over a camp and he's going to give us all over into the hand of this Gideon. And once he hears that, now he's ready to rally the troops. So in verse 15, we read these words. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped God. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands. Dividing 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. In fact, I'm going to just break down as we work through this into 4 scenes. And the first scene, I'm going to call this God's battle. But the one thing that I just want to note, and this is where we ended last week, was this is the first time that Gideon acknowledges that it's God's hand that's going to be doing the delivering. But the question is he going to continue to give God credit, or is he going to still try to take it for himself? Verse 17, watch me, he told them, follow my lead. When I go to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. Oh yeah, and for me too. Make sure I'm down. So, let's get credit where credit's due, okay? So again, he just had to add that in. Right? So again, is this for God or is this for Gideon? So then Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp, and the beginning of the middle watch, that's roughly around midnight, just after they had changed the guard, they blew their trumpets, broke their jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding it in their right hands, the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midians ran, crying, as they fled. Now, there's a slight little change there. That time it says not just for the Lord and for Gideon, it's a sword for the Lord, a sword for Gideon. And I just want to just give a little credit. I came in this morning and I had a nice surprise. I had a sword on my desk. I was tempted to bring it in, but I just didn't know if you're allowed to bring brandish actual weapons in church. So I figured maybe I'll just leave that in my office for now. There's a backstory of why that came in, but somebody mentioned sword, and I said, hey, actually that fits this Sunday because we have a sword for Lord and sword for Gideon. And now I have sword for Pastor Jeff too. That's pretty cool. I'm pretty happy about that. And then it says this in verse 22, when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men through the camp to turn on each other with their swords. That is a pretty cool way, kind of cool strategy. So picture this, it's this massive army camp, and a little bit later we learn that there's roughly 135,000. But they surround this camp, and it's a mix of Midianites plus some other armies. And at midnight, when it's all dark, when everything is quiet, all of a sudden you have people just shattering these things of pottery, you have blowing of trumpets, you have yelling and screaming, for God and for Gideon, and then you also, so you have all, plus, and everywhere you look, you see flames surrounding this mass campground. So literally it throws everybody into chaos, into confusion. They just start pulling up their swords and slashing each other. But what's unique about this, it says God turned them. He's like, even that dream said, God will turn over, will topple it. And so they do it. It's actually the Lord's sword who's kind of controlling this. And meanwhile, Gideon and his people just standing back, holding their trumpet and holding their torches and just watching it all happen. After all this chaos ensues, we pick things up, and it says this: the army fled to Beth Shittah and towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah near Tabbath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country to Ephraim, saying, again, those are different tribes of Israel, come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth Barah. Now, something a little bit potentially is going a little bit askew here. Right? Earlier in chapter 7, Gideon asks, well, why do we need to reduce the men? He says, for one reason earlier, I'm reducing it down to 300 people so everybody will know it's not by your hand, but it's by my hand that you're being saved. And so there's this initial victory, and immediately what does Gideon do? Again, he rallies those troops of those three tribes that had gone back, that just over 31,000 people. He brings in another tribe to help them. So again, will this victory look like God's, or will it look like Gideon along with the Israelites? So then it says this: so all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they took the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth Barah. They also captured two of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb on the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. Just a couple little really cool things. Just add this in. Oreb actually means raven. Zeb means wolf. I don't know what that means and what the purpose of that is, but I just don't think it's cool. But here's the other thing that should be noticed. Oreb is killed on a rock, right? When we meet the angel of the Lord and there's that first sacrifice, the angel says, put it on this rock. And where Gideon meets the angel of the Lord, it's in a winepress. And it's almost as though the whole story of Gideon has come full circle. You'd expect the story to end here, right? God, with the help of Gideon, helped deliver the people, brought people back to the land, drove out the Midianites, the oppressors. This is how you would typically expect the story to end, but it doesn't actually end there. Verse 8, we read this, chapter 8 begins this way: now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call on us when you went to fight Midian? And they criticized him sharply. Now, Gideon should have an obvious response for the Midianites. The reason why I didn't call you is because I was following the instructions of the Lord. He said he wanted a reduced number, only 300 men. That's why I didn't call you. But listen to the way Gideon responds. But he answered them, what have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? That's the name of his family tribe. God gave Oreb and Zeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you? At this, their resentment against him subsided. So he appeases their ego. But he's almost jealous of them, right? He's like, look, you got the better victory than I did, so why are you complaining? Now again, you would think this is where the story ends, but it doesn't end. That first battle is why I'm calling God's battle. That's the initial reason why God raised Gideon up to help deliver them, to drive out the Midianites. But now there's a second battle. It's on the other side of the Jordan, and this is one that's fought because of Gideon's ego. Listen to it. There's no command from God to do this, and God seems to be somewhat absent from this second battle. Verse 4, Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted, yet keeping up the pursuit, came to Jordan and crossed over it. He said to the men of Sukkoth, give me troops, some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zeba, Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. So Ephraim takes on 2 military leaders, but now Gideon's going, I'm going to take out their 2 kings, right? I don't want to leave with these kings. But the officials of Sukkoth said this way, do you already have the hands of Zeba and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops? Basically, there's that idea of hands as meaning the power. They're just saying, hey, Gideon, isn't this overkill? Hasn't already God given you their army into their hands? Why are you still pursuing this? Right? They've driven them out of the lands. And then listen to what Gideon says. Just for that, when the Lord has given Zeba and Zalmunna into my hands, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars. All right, nice guy. What does he promise? Don't do as I say. I'm going to humiliate you. I'm going to bring back revenge on you for what you've done. Now, at first he says, when God gives me these people, then I will do it. But notice a slight change here. He says, verse 8, he says this, from there he went up to Peniel and made the same request of them. And again, these are 2 cities just sort of on the outskirts of Israelite land. And they answered the same as the men of Sukkoth. It's saying, hey, God's already given them into your hands. This is overkill. You don't need to do this. So he said to the men of Peniel, when I return literally in peace, when I bring about peace. Now again, it's Gideon who's claiming the victory. No longer God is now absent. And he goes, then I will tear down this tower, right? When I bring peace, then I'm going to come back here and bring violence to your city. Nice guy, right? And you're actually going to see this idea of this theme of this tower with his son Abimelech next week. So again, Gideon gets this response that he goes, because you didn't do as I say, I'm going to bring back revenge and humiliation. Verse 10, now Zeba and Zalmunna were in Karkar, with a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the army of the eastern peoples. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. So again, you're just around 10%, 10 to 15% left of the original. Like they've decimated the foreign arms trade. They've driven them out of the land. And Gideon went up to the route of the nomads of the east of Noba and Jogababeh, whatever that word is, fell upon the unsuspecting army, Zeba and Zalmunna, the 2 kings of Midian, and fled, but pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. So let me just give you a quick little map here, so just get an idea. So the initial part, this way over here to the west of the Jordan, then they cross over. The Ephraimites, basically clear out to finish off the army, whatever little they can at the Jordan River, but he pursues them. That second little area is the area where he goes to those 2 cities to ask for help for food. They say no. He goes all the way to Karkor, way out of Israelite territory, and then beyond that to places we don't even know, but he's gone like way off the map, right? Just in pursuit of these enemies. And you might ask, well, what did all this? Well, what motivated him? Verse 13, Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Haris. This is verse 13 and 14 here. He caught a young man of Sukkoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Sukkoth, the elders of the town. Then Gideon came and said to the men of Sukkoth, here are Zeba and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, do you already have the hands of Zeba and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men, right? Again, so he taunts them. Then he took the elders of the town and taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of that town. Nice guy, eh? But one of the things that Gideon introduces now that's also going to be carried out through the rest of the book of the Judges. Up until this point, the enemies have always been outside. It's always been Israelite versus an outside nation. This is the first time that Gideon has actually turned the attention and he's starting to fight against his own family, against his own nation, his own people. And what's the motivating factor? Revenge, right? And it just gets worse as we kind of meet some of the further judges. And then he says this. He comes and he says, well, why on earth, the next question is, well, why on earth would he go to all that length? Why would he travel all that distance to get these two Midianite kings? Verse 18, listen to what it says. He says, then he asked Zebah and Zalmunna, what kind of men did you kill at Tabor? And listen to the response. He said, men like you. They answered, each one with the bearing of a prince. Gideon replied, those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. You get that? So why did he go all those lengths? Probably because he wanted to have a little bit of one-up. He didn't want the Ephraimites to have the big goal of killing the two military leaders, so he's going to go get the kings. But ultimately, it's about revenge. The other thing that's really, really unique, if you remember last week when we meet Gideon, the first thing that he said was, oh, I'm just from a poor family. I'm a nobody, right? We're the weakest clan. And then as you kind of read the story, you realize, it sounds like your family is a little bit more prestigious than you'd like to imagine. And here, what are they described as? They look like you. They look like royalty. They look like princes. So either Gideon was doing some serious lying back then, or as soon as he got into a place of power, he used that to lift up his family to take on sort of a role that showed, hey, look at me. Take as much prestige as possible. And this is, again, why we know this is revenge. Verse 19 finishes this way. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you. Right? You took out my brothers, I'm taking you out. And this next part, I just love this because this is so fitting for Family Day weekend. You just want something nice and warm and feel really good about Family Day weekend. And he goes, turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, kill them. But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and was afraid. So again, the first thing we start with Gideon, the first thing characteristic that describes him is that he's a fraidy cat, and now he's trying to turn his son, his scared son, into a hardened villain. As I was thinking of, isn't that a nice, warm, fuzzy thing for Family Day weekend here? You know, good family connections. I always grew up that, you know, the family that prays together stays together. It's close. The family that slays together stays together, I think. That's not the slaying down the hill kind. Verse 21, Zebah and Zalmunna said, come, do as is the man, so is his strength. So Gideon stepped forward and killed them, and then he took the moon ornaments off their camels' necks. And so it ends, kills these kings, and then the last detail we said, he actually took their pagan symbols from them, took them for himself. Now you'd often think, okay, this is now where the Gideon narrative is going to close. He's peace. There's no more Midianites to deal with. This is again how all the other judges up to this point, here's the victory. Victory ends. There's peace. But God says, no. There's still more I need to tell you about Gideon. And I'm going to say there's one more battle that Gideon, he lets us know. And this is not a battle against Midianites, not a physical battle against an army. But it's the moral battle of Gideon's soul. And yes, he may have had some victory on the battlefield, but with his own character, with his own soul, he failed miserably. So let's look at verse 22. He says, the Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of the Midian. So this is after the victory, first challenge. Here's the first request. Will you be our king? But why is the reason why they said, we want to ask you to be our king? And it says this, because you have saved us out of the hand of Midian. What should Gideon's first response? Oh no, it wasn't me. Oh, that's shucks, that's kind of nice. But it actually was God who saved you. I'm just his servant. I'm just his messenger. Listen to Gideon's response. Now, it sounds on the surface really, really nice, really, really pious. But Gideon said to him, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. That sounds pretty good. But here's the thing about Gideon, and I think I may have put Pinocchio back up there again, is as soon as Gideon says something or looks like he does something good, then his actions immediately following it seem to counteract that, contradict that idea. Because listen to how he responds. He goes, no, I won't be your king. God will be your king, but I do have a favor. 24, and he said, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder. And it was the custom that the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. So the first thing he says, no, I won't be a king, but I will take the king's ransom. I will tax you like a king. They answered, we'll be glad to give them over to you. They spread out a garment, and each man threw a ring from the plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels. That's between 40 and 50 pounds of gold. Not too bad. Not counting the ornaments, the pendants, the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were around the camels' necks. But yeah, all the royal stuff, I'm going to take that too. That's going to be for me. So again, he says, no, I don't want to be king, but then he begins to act like a king. And then verse 27, it says this, Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town, and all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and became a snare to Gideon and his family. The story begins with Gideon literally taking out a pagan shrine, tearing it down from his own home, which God asked him to do, and it ends by him reestablishing, building up a new one. A little bit confusing, there's that term ephod. Some of us don't really know what an ephod is. One of the questions that was asked that we should consider as we go through this book is, where's the tabernacle? Where's the tabernacle? Where's the religious system in this day? Well, the ephod was the cloak, the garment that only one person in the land of Israel was to wear, and that was the high priest, the Levitical high priest, and it was only to be worn at the tabernacle. And all of a sudden, at the end of the day, Gideon not only sort of takes on this role of king, but he takes on this role of high priest. He moves the religious center of the kingdom away from the tabernacle, which was probably around in Shiloh at this time, and moved it into his own town. And it said the whole land played the prostitute to this land. So again, it's not so good. And then verse 28 says this, Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land enjoyed peace for 40 years. So again, this is the way all of the other judges end, and you think, okay, he's got to be done now. But he adds one more piece of evidence against Gideon. And again, this fits well with Family Day. He says, let me share a little bit more about Gideon's legacy. 29 says this, Jeroboam, son of Joash, went back home to live. And that's, again, another name that Gideon got. And it's funny that at the conclusion, they call him not Gideon, but Jeroboam, which means, may Baal contend with them. And it's almost like at the end, God says, okay, I'm putting him back into Baal's hands. I'm wiping my hands clear of this nincompoop. Verse 30, he had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. You'll notice some of the other judges like to have lots of offspring coming up. Deuteronomy 17 warns about kings. It says this, the kings must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. He failed pretty miserably on those things. Verse 31, it says this, his concubine who lived in Shechem also bore him a son, who he named Abimelech. Remember, he said, no, I won't become your king, nor will my son or my grandson become your king. Next week, Pastor Dave's teaching about Abimelech, who just happens to be Gideon's son, who actually becomes king. And just to let you know, the name Abimelech means my dad is king. Just if you want to know, nice person. Of course, it's all about God being king there, Gideon. And then it's verse 32, it says this, Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-Berinth as their god and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show kindness to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, for all the good things he had done for them. Right? That's Gideon. Good old St. Gideon. Power corrupts. Absolute power has a tendency to corrupt, absolutely. How did Kendra do? Don't be an idiot like Gideon. Did she kind of get the message pretty accurate there? Now, there's a lot of things to think through when it comes to Gideon. A lot of things that came to my head. One of the things that we're going to look at, especially next week, is the sins of the father do have a way of coming back and infecting the sins of the later generations, the sins of the sons that follow. There's a lot of leadership principles there to think about, even just this idea that sometimes results may not be the most important thing, but character also counts. So we maybe need to pay attention to the character of who we place in leadership. But one of the things that I really thought that really stood out for me this week was, it really has two parts. The first thing is the importance of reading Scripture closely and well. Very often, if you went to Sunday school, you hear the story of Gideon, and Gideon always comes across as this great example of faith, this great Old Testament hero. We sort of end the story halfway through, and again, we push this idea, let's be just like Gideon, this fearless leader. But then again, when you look a little bit more deeper beyond the surface, you realize, Gideon, he's got some issues. He's a troubling person. So why do people get so confused? Why, like in Sunday school lessons, do we always paint Gideon as this great guy? And again, we got this, one of the most famous international ministries is called the Gideons, who plays Bibles everywhere, right? Why do we get that? Well, if you just skim read the passage, there's a lot of things that you can give credit to. On the surface, Gideon does a lot of good things. He tears down a pagan shrine in his family. That looks pretty good. He often says things that give credit to God, or at least on the surface. But then as soon as you look right next to it, he's discounting what he said, or he's twisting the words slightly. So on a surface, it can look really like, hey, he is a pretty good guy. He's a pretty faithful guy. Yeah, he's not perfect. Yeah, he had a kind of issue with the women, took on maybe one or two extra wives than he needed. But other than that, he's pretty good. One of the things that I thought of, especially when it comes to the church, when it comes to our faith, right? If you go across this town, cross this country, into every country, to every land, there's all sorts of churches. There's all sorts of leaders. A lot of times, they all preach from the same book. We all sing, a lot of times, the same songs. And you're like, how do you judge between what's truly godly and God-glorifying to that which is a fraud? And at the end of the day, there's one thing that I think helps separate truth from falsehood. That which is God-glorifying and that which is a fraudulent, which is self-glorifying. Gideon was happy to use all the God speak, all the God language, do all those things, but at the end of the day, it was all very narcissistic. It was always about giving him the glory, taking him the roles himself. And I think one of the dividing things, if you want to see if a church, if a place that purports to worship, to honor God, is it one that elevates self? Is it a person that elevates personality? Or is it one that is always going to give and push back the credit and the glory back to God? Is it one that lifts itself up? Or lifts one that surrenders themselves so that God can have the credit and the glory? And I think let's just close with that. We're going to call the worship team up to close with our final song.